Welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us. We're still waiting for one of our speakers to join and give us a few more minutes as we work through the process. And we will be sharing this on Facebook. So if you also would like to share this webinar with your contacts, start a watch party from your own account, share it by all means. So we'll have as much audience as possible to join us as we go through the process. We're going to start the conversation sharp at 12 with our speakers. We're still waiting for Valma to join us. And the broadcast will begin on Facebook at 12 noon. So in case you want to run and get a drink of water or have any other type of a break, by all means do that. We are taking questions. I know some of you submitted questions online for our earlier, my earlier emails for 2 days, and we have those set of questions that some of you have submitted. But in the webinar also there is the Q&A. Also, you could do that. So let me share the Facebook link with you guys. Just give me a second. So you could share it from this link. As soon as we begin, it will be broadcast there. And also you could pick it from my own page as well. So we'll be streaming in both sides to begin with, and then a whole bunch of others. You could begin writing your questions once we get into later on the conversation. We could do it. Valma, welcome. Good to see you.
Hello.
How are you? Good. And if we're already live, so we're waiting for the participants to join and populate. So people are joining, and then it also will be shared on Facebook as well. I see we have I see that Professor Algar joined us. So say salam to Professor Algar, Professor Emeritus at UC Berkeley. See Professor Ahlam Muhtasib from Cal State, San Bernardino. See Amanji Aziz from the Netherlands joining us as well. So good. I'm not going to go through and introduce the people that I know directly. I will mention it. Okay. Muhammad Abbasi from New Jersey. Munir in Canada. Munir, welcome. Good to have you. Also, Munir Sheikh is joining us from LA, Southern California. Okay, let me. Hafsa also works on Kashmir. So Hafsa Kanjawal, Professor Hafsa, it's good to see you. She was with us with on a panel just last week, focusing on situation in Kashmir, which almost is representing a similar type of circumstances in a different way. Fakhra Sheikh from San Francisco, welcome. Good to see you and have you with us. Okay. I know we're just waiting, and just give us 7 more minutes and we'll begin. Again, we're starting sharp at 12, and you have questions, the question and answer period also will be here. We'll be having conversation, and make sure to share if you can share it on your Facebook. Start please a watch party so it goes to all of your friends, that they will be able to immediately get an alert and watch. This is also, we're learning the technology as we speak. So now, we used to be professors where you go into the library and the main stacks and lose yourself for a few hours. Now you have to be both a techie and a historian simultaneously. So I'm just going to begin entering the work. See what is in here. We'll also try to take questions from Facebook if people actually ask questions in Facebook as well, so you could alert people to that as well. Okay, so we could begin broadcasting now, so we could give people the time to share. So welcome everyone, and good afternoon. And for those that are in Bosnia, good evening. For those on the West Coast, we're in between. It's really a pleasure to have you for this really important, significant webinar focusing on the 25th anniversary of the Srebrenica Massacre and really the erasure of the Bosnian Genocide. It's really recently I've been writing on memory and history, and what do we think or consider important dates to remember, and how do we mark history, and which history do we actually point and assert to be significant, and which history gets to be erased. And also just a broader questions, the calendar that we use is also point to, it's not a neutral, but actually comes out of a particular type of power relations that also influences how we view the broader events. So the Bosnian Genocide is an important and significant occurrence coming at a point of the collapse of the Soviet Union, the end of the Cold War, and as part of it, the notion of what events took place thereafter, and in particular, since World War II, the type of atrocities, the type of war crimes, genocide, and an attempt to erase a whole population from the center of Europe. More importantly, the webinar for me is also significant because many in the alt-right, the white nationalists, the replacement theories, those who work with an attempt to problematize both the Muslim presence but also immigrant refugees, have used the Bosnian genocide as a good case of how to actually solve the problem. And again, this problem that exists in there. So for me, as we looked at the New Zealand Christchurch attack and the playing and the use of certain references to the Bosnian genocide, both in terms of these manifestos that are put out, so how we actually think in the broader notions relative to genocides and the crimes in Bosnia. And then the other dimension of it is the gendered aspect of the war crimes, the gendered aspect of targeting the Muslim woman in general. I do work on Islamophobia. Violent attacks, violent Islamophobic attacks tend to actually target women predominantly. Research data in France, in the UK, even in the US, that 80% of Islamophobic attacks tend to target women. And we see this notion as it relates to the genocide and what took place. So I'm really want to listen and learn myself. I don't consider myself to be an expert by any means on Bosnia and the Bosnian situation. I visited, been to Sarajevo post-war, and really I see myself as a student of this conversation as much as I'm attempting to get this going. So I have four dear colleagues, some I know them for a long time, some that I just met. Dr. Ahmed Zeltic holds a PhD degree from the University of California in Berkeley in the intellectual history of later Islamic tradition. He completed his doctoral dissertation entitled Friends and Foe, the Early Ottoman Reception of Ibn Arabi. And both him and myself work under the same supervision, Professor Algar. So both we have met often. We're talking about Cafe Strada in Berkeley has really used much of our money, but also have given us considerable caffeine to keep us going. So welcome, Ahmed, for being with us. Our second panelist, Ermin Sinanovic, is Executive Director of the Center for Islam in the Contemporary World at Shenandoah University, where he is also a scholar in residence. Before joining the center, he was Director of Research and Academic Program at the International Institute of Islamic Thought and an assistant professor in the Department of Political Science at the United States Naval Academy in Annapolis, Maryland. And I have the pleasure of meeting and being on panels and discussions with Ermin for a number of events. Our third panelist, Velma Seric, if I pronounced this name wrongly, please correct me, is a researcher, a journalist, peace building expert, and human rights defender for Sarajevo, Bosnia, and Herzegovina. Velma is the founder and president of the Post-Conflict Research Center and the founder and editor-in-chief of Balkan Discourse. As a researcher and producer, she has worked on numerous publications and films about the 1992-1995 Bosnian War, including the Ospomi, is that correct? 677, In the Land of Blood and Honey by Angelina Jolie, and I Came to Testify and War Redefined from the BBS series, Women, War, and Peace. So definitely we're gonna have a conversation about that. Velma is a Columbia University Fellow as part of the Alliance for Historical Dialogue and Accountability Fellowship Program. Welcome. Our fourth, last panelist, but for sure, and not the least, Dr. Sabiha Hosic is a psychotherapist and interreligious peace builder and the director of NGO Medica Zenica in Bosnia-Herzegovina. She holds a PhD degree in gender studies from the University of Sarajevo, and her doctoral thesis on criticism and transformation of social support models for survivors of war sexual violence in Bosnia and Herzegovina, feminist and cultural perspective. So we look forward to having a conversation. So welcome. So the first question, I really, maybe just give us a background about Bosnia, maybe a little bit of history, just to ground us before we get into the actual civil war. So Ahmed, if you could maybe give us some brief historical sketch.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Dr. Hattem, for having me. And well, for sure, I hope I will be able to do that very briefly. It's basically the region of the Balkans was a Roman province inhabited by indigenous population and settlers. So what's important and the magistral point in history is actually the migration of the South Slavs into the area, which began around 6th century. And we quite soon begin to see state formations, particularly in case of Bosnia. The first mention is in 11th century in a very famous work, the Administrando Imperio, by the Byzantine Emperor Constantine Porphyrogenus, who mentions Bosnia as a very small principality on the upper flows of the Bosnia River, which actually vertically cuts through the country. And we have a document which is usually considered to be like a birth certificate for Bosnia. It's called the Charter of Kulimban, or Povelja Kulinabana in our language, which was given to Dubrovnik or Ragusa. It was written in 12th century, so it already marks the beginning or actually a certain phase in the history of medieval Bosnian kingdom, which lasted from 10th century until the middle of 15th century, when we see various ruling houses. Especially important is the Kotromanić house, and in the 14th century there is the largest geographical extent of Bosnia. Of course, another very important date is 1463, when the medieval Bosnian kingdom was overrun by the Ottoman Turks in the very same manner that all other medieval kingdoms to the east of Bosnia were conquered. And thus a period of the Ottoman rule begins, which basically lasted until the late 19th century, when Austro-Hungarians, after the Berlin Congress in 1879, if I'm not mistaken, they actually began their administration. In 1908, they annexed officially Bosnia as part of their Austrian and Hungarian Empire. And quite soon we have, after that, we have the famous assassination in Sarajevo, which is probably the only historical event that people from around the world would know about Sarajevo and Bosnia, which started the First World War. Following the end of that war, we have first Kingdom of the Serbs and Croats and the Slovenes, then Kingdom of Yugoslavia, which basically takes us to the World War II. And after a brief, or not so brief, I should say, after the Nazi occupation of the Balkans, and ultimately their expulsion by Tito's partisans, we have so-called Tito's Yugoslavia, or the Third Yugoslavia, forming in 1945, and it lasted for 45 years until its disintegration in a series of bloody armed conflicts, starting with Slovenia, which was actually called a 10-day war because it lasted only for 10 days. It was in 1991. Then it was followed by an armed conflict in Croatia from 91 to 95. And in a way, it culminated in Bosnia from, let's say, early 1992. The actual date depends because various areas of Bosnia were attacked at different times. But in case of Sarajevo, for example, it's usually April 92. And it lasted until December of 1995, when the Dayton peace agreement was signed by all the parties. So it would be a really very brief sketch and walk. Of course, we can drop many names and many dates, but this is a sketch of Bosnian history from, let's say, 10th century, when we have a self-awareness of it as being a separate principality from neighboring countries of Croatia and Serbia. And there's, of course, a lot of overlapping, and in terms of territory, certain parts of Bosnia were at some points part of medieval Serb kingdom or Croatian kingdom, and vice versa. So it's a grossly simplifying a quite long and complicated history, but it just gives us a basic chronology for what we need to discuss today.
Like maybe you could drop maybe a recommended reading or a good article history that, I'm always as a teacher thinking about some material that we could put. So if you could drop anything on the chat for a reading material to recommend, that would be great. Sure. And I think we'll definitely share it with others.
I think John Fine wrote a couple of articles and books, and also Noel Malcolm, whose book is basically like the start of reading for the history of Bosnia.
Great. Erman, maybe could you touch a little bit on Islam in Bosnia? When did we mentioned about its arrival relative with the Ottomans, but maybe also are there some distinctive features relative to the Muslim community in Bosnia before we get into the actual conflict in 1992?
Sure. So salam to everyone, and thank you so much, Hatim, for having us and for inviting all of us here to this panel. So Islam came to Bosnia even before the conquest by the Ottomans. I mean, there are signs of small isolated communities of Muslims who settled in the area of the Balkans, even a couple of centuries prior to the coming of the Ottomans. But really, in a big way, Islam comes to Bosnia with the Ottomans, with the conquest of that was led by Mehmed Fatih. And we heard his name very prominently in the last few days with the reopening of the Hagia Sophia Mosque in Constantinople, in Istanbul. And it is interesting to know that the conquest of Bosnia happened only 10 years after the conquest of Constantinople. So it is coterminous almost, or cotemporal, I'm sorry, with the conquest of Constantinople. For that reason, Islam in Bosnia bears distinctive Ottoman hallmarks. It is rooted in Maturidi Aqidah, for those who know that kind of theology. It is rooted in a Hanafi school of jurisprudence, and in cultural mores and customs that were imparted by the Ottomans to the Bosnian population. However, what is also interesting is, just like in any other place in the world, there is a dose of syncretism in Bosnian Islam, which is that many of the practices that were prevalent in that part of the world or in that region prior to the coming of the Ottomans got somehow integrated into the practice of Islam. And that gives a birth to what came to be known in a definition by one of the leading Bosnian Muslim scholars, Fikret Karčić. He calls it the Islamic tradition of the Bosniaks, which he says has 6 distinctive categories, some of which are what I already mentioned in terms of theology and jurisprudence that are shared by many other Muslims. But there are also all these different cultural characteristics that are peculiar to that part of the world, including in the last several decades and perhaps even a century, experience of Muslims living under the secular rule and secular governments that are non-Muslim in nature. And for that reason, after Islam had been introduced by an imperial force, the Ottomans, in which Islam was the dominant culture and the dominant religion, and in which laws and many other things were based on Islamic culture and customs and religion, Muslims in Bosnia have now had about 140 years of experience of living under the rule of what you could call secular non-Muslim governments, and that necessitated that they adjust and adapt many of their practices over this more than a century and over these last decades, that accommodated between the secular mode of the government on the one hand and their own traditions, cultures, which they've inherited through generational practice of Islam on the other. At the same time, they also have experience of living with non-Muslim population. A large population of Bosnia remain non-Muslim. The Catholics and the Orthodox Christians predominating among the other two confessions in Bosnia. And the interesting thing is that all three groups share the same language, understand each other very well. Many of the basic cultural customs are shared across different groups in Bosnia. And even among the non-Muslim groups in Bosnia, there is a strong influence of Islamic culture, even in vocabulary, in daily practices and so on. You can still hear expressions and customs that are distinctively Muslim in origin. So that kind of intermix is, I think, what creates this Islam in Bosnia. Not to mention, of course, that Muslims of Bosnia are the indigenous population to that land, and go way back in history, all the way to the Roman empires and so on. And the intermix of the Slavs and the indigenous population is what gives this kind of mixture that is unique to this part of the world.
And hopefully later on we'll get into the process of racialization of Muslim identity and therefore externalizing the individual. Can we maybe shift right now to the actual civil war and the 1992-95 civil war? And I wanted for you to talk from a personal perspective about your own perspective on the unfolding events. How did it happen? What actually took place? And where were you at that time? And how was your, again, if you were, I assume that every one of you was born, your family, so on. So take us through your own personal perspective into the unfolding events. Maybe if Dr. Sabiha, you could begin with maybe your own perspective on that, and then we'll go to Wilma and come back.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hattem, to invite me to give some experiences from my country, from Bosnia and Herzegovina. That question is so interesting. I remember that I was student second year of Islamic studies of university in Sarajevo when the war started in my country, in Bosnia and Herzegovina. I listened news that the war started, but I truly didn't believe in that. However, when the war came in my native town, Vitez, when the Croatian army violently expelled me and my family from our home, I accepted that war was in country in Bosnia and Herzegovina. In 1993, I came as a refugee together with my parents to Zenica from my native town, Vitez. I remember that I was so happy that we survived, but from the other side, I was so sad because a lot of women survived war, rape, and sexual violence, were wounded. Mostly men were in concentration camps, and many families had missing members. Also, my brother was in concentration camp and my father was wounded. Having all that in mind, I decided in that very hard time to be so active, to help, support, and show empathy for women and children who have been suffering from that time till now, almost 28 years. I work with survivors as well as build and contribute for reconciliation and peace in my country, in Bosnia and Herzegovina. And also I want to mention that I don't want to use civil war for the war in Bosnia and Herzegovina. In that time, I also had a lot of questions, but what was so important was that I have recognized the first light in women's organization Medica in Zenica, where women of different professions, ethnic backgrounds decided to stay together, showed solidarity, to care for women and children, giving them safe place, following their basic needs, and developing comprehensive support and help, especially for survivors of war, rape, and sexual violence. Medica as a women's organization was a first organization that was established to help and support women, girls, survivors of war, rape, and sexual violence, to encourage them, to help them to speak up about horrible experiences.
Thank you. Velma, Dr.
Hello, thank you so much for the invitation, Dr. Hatem, and thank you for organizing this event. So as Sabiha mentioned, I would like to kind of try to clarify a few things because we do have a lot of debates about the character of war in Bosnia. And I completely don't agree that this was a civil war, because we can prove this through the work of International Tribunal for former Yugoslavia with like many different judgments and the character of the recent past. We would be able to say that this war was much more war of aggression. And if you take a look, Dr. Ahmed explained a little bit, it's quite complicated to give a background of what actually happened. We have to start it from 89 and the fall of Berlin Wall. But I mean, if we take a look, the character of war in Bosnia, especially looking the role of two neighboring countries, Serbia and Croatia, we can find plenty of elements, including the judgment of International Tribunal in Hague for the involvement of the government of Serbia from 92 till 95. So it wasn't civil war. That is what I would like to kind of clarify in the beginning. Where I've been during the war and how actually I experienced this is, I've been teenager. I've been in a small city near Eastern Bosnia, Kladanj, which is actually was the first free territory for refugees who were coming from Eastern Bosnia. My city was also under the siege and we did suffer a lot, but I would say that the biggest problem was the huge humanitarian disaster. On 1995, my mom took me to my elementary school where actually we placed the women and children from Srebrenica. And that was the time when I actually realized that, you know, genocide had happened. And I would say that, you know, I was 16, probably that is what did reshape my life and what brought me to do this work for 17 different years. I'm not going to talk too much about work of my organization. Whoever is interested can go to the website. It would take a lot of time, but I'm going to mention the work I did. From 2003 till 2007, I worked for the University of Sarajevo Institute for Research, Crime Against Humanity and International Law. My first project were mass graves in Eastern Bosnia. Then I spent 8 years doing the court reporting from Hague Tribunal for Institute for War and Peace Reporting. I did work for Balkan Investigating Reporting Networks a couple of years, and then I established Post-Conflict Research Center. So the core of our work is peace building, but also conflict prevention, genocide prevention. And I can speak more about that later because probably you have some other questions for us. So I'm not going to keep too long on my personal background. Thank you.
Sure. Erman? Yeah.
Yeah, so my journey is a little bit different because I wasn't in Bosnia when the aggression on Bosnia started, and I thank both Sabiha and Velma for problematizing the whole issue of the civil war, because the civil war somehow suggests that you have a group of people who along certain lines, they start disagreeing and fighting each other. What we have in Bosnia is a much more complicated situation where you have the armies from the neighboring countries, from Serbia and Montenegro, as well as Croatia, attacking and operating in Bosnia. So there are strong elements of international aggression on Bosnia and Herzegovina here that I think oftentimes get forgotten in international media when they just talk about civil war in Bosnia. There are strong elements of international aggression as well. So I think that is something that needs to be obviously highlighted. But my journey was a little bit different because I was like Sabiha, I was a student when the war started, but I was a student in Croatia I was in Zagreb, the capital of Croatia.
Mm.
And so I was cut off from the country and from my family. And so I cannot claim that my suffering was at the level, not nearly at the level of those who were in the country at that time, but being cut off and sometimes for weeks and months, not knowing what was going on, not being able to get in touch with the family, not to mention the deprivation that that causes, you know, being cut off from the family that was the only source of your financial support at the same time was very, very difficult. And I think we all have experienced there. I don't think there is a single Bosnian, and especially Bosniak, Bosnian Muslim, that did not experience trauma and that does not carry trauma. Some of us have never treated it. Some of us have treated it. And I think it is important to acknowledge that. I know that deep inside, there is a trauma inside of me that comes out every now and then when I remember certain things, or where I watch the videos and documentaries about the war and the suffering that people went through. So, so there is that. From then on, I was fortunate enough to end up in Malaysia, where I studied when the war was still raging in Bosnia. And for those of us who were overseas at that time, who were outside of Bosnia, there was a kind of a guilt because we felt we were young, we should be in our country and fighting and defending it, and we were not able to do that. And for that reason, there is a sort of an interesting dynamic going on. Eventually, of course, the war ended with the Dayton peace agreement, and that was a great cause for celebration for many of us overseas, that at least that type of suffering is going to stop. But here we are 25 years later, and we know that many of the things that we hoped would get better after the war did not necessarily get better. But at the same time, there was also tremendous improvement and progress that was made. We often forget how devastated some parts of the Bosnia were during and after the war. I remember Mostar, for instance. I'm from Jablanica, which is a bit to the south and close to Mostar, which is the place of that famous Ottoman bridge that was destroyed during the war. And Mostar was pretty much, especially the Muslim side, was pretty much flattened to the ground. If you go now, it's being rebuilt. So there are signs of very visible improvement. The fact of what Velma mentioned, that she was in The Hague and followed that many of these war criminals had been caught and put in jail and had been prosecuted and found guilty, was tremendous improvement. Is it at the level where many of us would be really happy with how justice was meted out after the war? Probably not, because there are so many war criminals that are still walking the streets of Bosnia that had never been apprehended or prosecuted. So there's been an improvement, and I think many of us still carry that trauma, and it is something that is going to remain with us for the rest of our lives, and probably is going to be intergenerational as well.
Ahmed?
Well, I think a lot is being said by the fact that I was 15 at the beginning of the war, and of course, I inhabited a completely different sphere. I was completely unaware of what was going on. It was only later, of course, by reading some memoirs and testimonies by some prominent political figures and generals and stuff, I became aware of the drama, basically, that was unfolding behind the curtain and behind the scene. And I was just a happy-go-lucky teenager with very different interests, and I got caught in the middle of other people's mess in a way. I was not in any way aware of what is at issue. And when it became obvious that it has something to do with our ethnic identity or confessional identity or territorial disputes and claims, maybe my case could be a good point. Like, I grew up as a happy nothing, like I was completely unaware of any of this stuff. And I only became aware of my being a Yugoslav as a citizen of this country when I applied for passport to visit Poland with the Scout boys in when I was maybe 10 or 11 years old. So this is my first idea of an identity. I'm a Yugoslav, and I have this little booklet in my hand, and I'm going to travel out of country with it, you know. And then when we started approaching the 90s, when the debate was heated and everything, I got this regional identity. Like when I would go to Croatia, to seaside or somewhere, then I would be like a Bosnian. Like this is a person who comes from Bosnia. So I have a state identity, then all of a sudden it gets shrink to this geographical identity. And then when things really got speeding up, even inside of Bosnia, I get this ethnic identity and also confessional identity. So now all of a sudden, I'm not even a Bosnian. Within Bosnia, I have to be boxed and categorized into some place. So I'm a Bosniak now, and I'm a Muslim now. So it just gets shrinking and shrinking. And it all happened in 5 years, like between me being 10 years old and 15 years old at the beginning of the war. So it was obviously very confusing, and very clearly I was all of that and none of that at the same time. It was a very fluid thing, and as every person has different layers of identity and they just keep shifting in significance. And I guess if you touch any of them, you make them a priority. It's called inat in our language, and I think it's comprehensible to all speakers of Arabic or Persian or Turkish. It's just the way it is. So I basically felt that I got caught up in other people's disputes, and I was not aware of the situations. We knew there's, of course, I was in Zenica, and it was, you know, I don't know how to say, but in a way, you know, it may sound strange to you, but those were the happiest days of my life, you know, because you just try to stay alive.
A young person that just was on the margin.
Every day is a triumph, you know. Every day is a triumph. You can plastically feel that you're alive. Like today, what's the day today? It's Tuesday. I'm alive, you know. So every day is like just it was very simple existence, and of course it was a lot of fear and constant shelling, and then later so whatever I have to, whatever I can say about it, it's a later knowledge. Like I reconstructed from the books, but I'm telling you about my experience and my genuine feelings at the beginning. So my generation was like, I had many friends. We all called each other by these nicknames, and Mickey and Kiki, and I was not aware of who is who, and I didn't really care, you know. At least I was not sure who is. Yeah. So you can say, oh, like for example, Zlatan Ibrahimovic is a Bosnian that everybody knows. So his mother is a Croatian, and his father is a Bosnian Muslim, and who is he? I don't know, and I don't really care. So this was the situation at the beginning of the war. So all of a sudden we got all these identities, which shows that somebody intervened on my behalf. So somebody is deciding for me and in my name, who am I and what group I should be part of, and stuff like that. And the war...
Get back to some of those discussions, the reconciliation, and whether those can be taken back or not. And I'm sorry to jump into the conversations into a much more heavier set, which is the gender genocide and the use of rape as an instrument of war. And really, no one can recover from a rape, but when rape is used as an instrument of genocide, maybe if somebody could speak about how that was utilized during the Bosnian genocide, and also dealing with those victims. And I remember at the time where even some Muslims who were dealing with this question of trying to get a religious dispensation or fatwa about these issues, not really taking the individual and the circumstances of what is taking place. So maybe we could talk about the gender genocide and the consequences and where we are at this particular time. Both maybe Balma and Sabiha can take those questions and bounce back and forth on it. You want to start, Sabiha, or on that question?
Okay, thank you so much for this question. When we speak about war rape, of course, it is very important that we speak about very horrible situation that women, girls were raped, that they survived sexual violence. In Bosnia and Herzegovina during the war, from 1992 till 1995, women were exposed to multiple trauma of war rape and sexual violence, losses, being refugees, dealing with missing members of families, wounds, and so on. We do not have exactly number how many women survived sexual violence, but some statistics show that approximately 50,000 women and children, girls under 18 years old in Bosnia and Herzegovina survived sexual violence and war rape. I also need to mention that in Medica Zenica, we are listening voice of survivors. Following their needs, we have developed holistic and comprehensive support, including medical support, individual and group therapy work, occupational therapy, provision of vocational training for them to finish some courses and get skills to find easy job in the community or to start some concrete business. When we speak about war and sexual violence, is very important to emphasize that is the most difficult form of violation of human rights, very often without possibility to describe all the consequences. Survivors felt fear, helplessness, and hopelessness after they survived war rape and sexual violence. Also, survivors of war rape felt humiliation. Some of them made even suicide when they survived sexual violence. They felt that they lost control over their own body, over their life. It's clear that it was an attack on their intimate part of the life. They survived special psychological trauma that keeps them in silence with a long psychological, social, economical, and health consequences. War rape and sexual violence was an attack to dignity of women and their families. We also have different research. Some of the research showed that more than 70% of survivors think that experiences of war rape completely have affected their lives. A lot of women till now after war rape deal with own secrets. It means that they stay in silence, that even some of families do not know what happened with them during the war. Survivors feel fear for themselves, their children and families, even after 25 years. In the research, 50% of survivors who participate in their responses mentioned that they were afraid about how their families will react if they would know about war rape and sexual violence. Some of their family members have looked at them as warless and responsible for destruction of the face of the family or credibility of family. They very often explained it by following words: credibility of husband, male members of families or complete families. It was very hard for survivors to deal with this explanation or with these words, what they listen from, even from their families. The consequences are apparent in a relationship with the children, husbands, or partners, and other members of the family and society. Also, the research showed 58% of participants felt that their rape experiences also affected the lives of their children, either fully or to some extent, and described a number of problems that show difficulties with parenting and with disclosing their experiences to their children. I want to share with you how it explained one of survivors.
Yeah.
One of survivors in her life story described it by words. I don't want that my destiny marks the life of my daughter. My daughter is happy now. She's very successful in her life. I wish that she continues with those feelings. Maybe one day, when she has her own children, I will tell her about my destiny when she becomes a mother to understand why I was angry, explosive, and closed in my room. With this, I want to stop.
Thank you. Valma, maybe you could touch on the International Tribunal and how it dealt also with the issue of, gender genocide and attack on women.
Yeah, I'm not expert for trauma, Sabiha just explained, and I'm going to mention from the different angle, and I'm going to highlight the courage actually of these women, because it's extremely important not to highlight just the courage of women who are victims of sexual violence and rape, but like in general, rural Bosnian women of Eastern Bosnia. So for the category of women who are victims of sexual rape and violence, we have to mention that they like literally changed the international law. These women from Eastern rural Bosnia, from Eastern rural town Foča, decided that 16 of them, they will stood up at the court at the Hague Tribunal and testified. And literally after they testified, the rape became crime against humanity. So this is extremely important to say. This recognition belongs to Bosnian women. On another hand, I'm going to mention, because the topic is genocide, so kind of like we are talking about genocide and it's 25th anniversary of Srebrenica genocide. So I would like to highlight the role of a woman of Srebrenica. For the women of Srebrenica, they actually, what they did is incredible. First of all, they, after they lost their husbands and fathers and sons and brothers, they were pushing a lot the international community, first of all, to establish International Commission of Missing People. Like literally, the International Commission of Missing People established the first DNA system for identifying victims, which is now replicable all around the world. And International Commission of Missing People is now based in Hague and, searching victims from Syria and like other parts of the world. So this recognition also belongs to Bosnian women. On another hand, the third recognition which I would like to give to these women of Srebrenica is building up the first state memorial. For many of you who don't know, we have a large problem of how we don't have a state law about the memorials and commemorations. So like literally we cannot agree still in a country how we will adopt this law. But the women of Srebrenica, they have been able to push the international community to establish the first state memorial, which is Srebrenica Genocide Memorial. So this recognition is also extremely important to know. We will go back a little bit to the Hague and the local trials. I want to mention, because I did see some of the questions trying to kind of go through chat, and maybe you do have a plan to ask us later, but I did see some questions related to the work of Mrs. Jolie and her film In the Land of Blood and Honey, but also some other filmmakers in Bosnia, like Jasmila Žbanić, who actually won the Golden Bear in Berlin with her film Grbavica, which is talking about transgenerational trauma. Then Angelina Jolie and many of other filmmakers and artists who really did raise awareness about rape and sexual violence. And Sabiha knows, she worked closely also with Angelina Jolie, that this film and this initiative actually created the governmental initiative by the British government preventing sexual violence in conflict. So I did see that some were asking, like, how could you support that kind of initiative? And it's portraying Muslim women in, like, you know, not like Muslim women in non-historical context. I have to say, for those who didn't saw this film, that it's extremely, extremely historically correct. It did portray the war in Bosnia, the war of aggression, the war of genocide, and the rape on correct historical way. So that is why I did work, and that is why I support, you know, what Ms. Jolie did and what she's doing now. So I will stop here. I can go, like, yeah, I can talk a lot. So let's go on another question.
There was a question that I'm picking up from Facebook in terms of what prompted the war in former regions of Yugoslavia, and was there tension beforehand, or did it come from nowhere all of a sudden? What is the genesis for it?
Can I?
Herman?
Yeah, it's very, very, very complicated. There are so many historical threads to this that are really hard to sort of pull together, especially for somebody who may not be well versed with the history of the region in Europe and the empires that ruled that area, starting with the Romans, then Byzantines, then the Ottomans, Austro-Hungarians. You know, there are layers of huge empires that have ruled this area that we are, you know, from where we came, and that we are inhabiting, that are part of our heritage, and create these multiple identities that sometimes are clashing with one another. But I would want to follow up on what both Sabiha and Velma said about violence against women. I would just put a sociological or political layer on all of this, which is that in the Serbian ideology of Greater Serbia, which to me is really the main culprit for all the wars that happened in the former Yugoslavia during and after the dissolution of the country, the Muslims of the region are especially prominent offenders, for the reason that in Serbian mythology, the Muslims in Bosnia, for instance, were originally Orthodox Christians. And so they view us as apostates from Christianity. And as apostates from Christianity, we are kind of like a bad seed of the Serbian people in their own mythology and ideology, and we need to be exterminated. And I think the use of rape as warfare, together with genocide, was really their way of cleansing that bad seed as they see it, which is kill all the men and rape the women and sort of restart. It is very brutal and very basic biological kind of view of that. But and that's one angle. It's not the only perspective. It's not the only layer, but it's the layer. If you know, by exterminating all the men and then basically raping as many women as possible, they could somehow remake these people into Serbs and into Christians again. It is a very vile, evil ideology, some of which we are actually hearing and the echoes of in Islamophobic rhetoric that is now happening all around the world, which, Hatem, you have pointed that 80% of all Islamophobic attacks happen against Muslim women. And there is a reason for that, because Muslim women are seen as in some way carriers of Muslim identity more than Muslim men. And for that reason, the women have to be sort of turned over, if you will. They have to be convinced that they should not be Muslim, or they should not give birth to Muslims, or whatever goes in the evil minds of people who are thinking these things. And that gendered violence is really so pervasive. It's not only in Serbian mythology. You find it in any kind of Islamophobic rhetoric. You find that a Muslim woman is one of the, if not the primary target for this type of violence. And Muslim men basically need to be exterminated because, you know, they cannot be trusted. So there is that layer as well, which I wanted to add to this conversation.
Your phone.
Often in reference to Muslims in Europe, at least maybe 20 or 30 years, the reference, these are Turks. So Turks was a reference as a statement of, derogative statement of somebody that doesn't belong. Was that deployed during the Bosnian genocide period? And how is that really connected to the whole memory and belonging and exclusion on that term as we shifted right now to the whole Islamophobic discourse? Ahmed, I saw that you wanted to jump in.
Yeah, I just wanted to fill in what Ermin just said. It appears to me that that Muslim women, I guess elsewhere, but in Bosnia, I know particularly is the case, were for one thing or another always an object of fascination by people who were not Muslims. And if you, for example, read some of the novels or some of the literary works written about Bosnia and life in Ottoman Bosnia, we can mention Ivo Andrić, we can mention many other writers. You can feel that he's on the slippery slope when he writes about Muslim woman. So Muslim man, he can meet in the bazaar, in coffee houses, in marketplaces, in the street, but the world of a Muslim woman is completely sealed off for him, and it's completely closed. So he can only use his imagination to try to penetrate into that world. And as this fascination was completely released in a very violent way during the war. So it was felt like a unique opportunity to violate Muslim woman body and her space, and to basically take revenge, because even if she goes out, she is covered in her house or in her backyard. The whole world of Muslim women is completely closed to them. And you can see this frustration when reading some of these things. As regards this causes of the conflict, I can understand this confusion, and as Ermin said, it's complicated, but we kind of emphasize on that point that everything is very complicated. Sometimes it's quite simple at times. So what I understand from the Serb ideological discourse is this idea that all the Serbs, this is how it all began basically in my opinion. So all the Serbs need to live in the same country. So as far as Yugoslavia was preserved, this condition was met. So there was no problems. So from, as you know, I have some maps, maybe I can try to share the screen, and you can, so Yugoslavia was formed from 6 republics, Serbia and Bosnia, Croatia, Slovenia, Macedonia, etc., etc. So as long as Yugoslavia was intact, this condition of all the Serbs to basically inhabit the same political and cultural space was met, and there was no problem. But when we started having this movement for independence, then one individual republic after another started to work for its independence, and it basically meant that this Serb national and ethnic body will be divided between 2 or 3 political units, and they got mobilized to preserve this, and they tried to carve out their ethnic enclaves and entities and countries that will basically be reunited with the mother Serbia, so to say. So this is why we talk about aggression, at least in the initial phases of these wars. Well, later on, maybe it got some elements of a civil war, because at some point in Bosnia, everybody was fighting everybody. So you can maybe talk about civil war in 94 or 95 and things like that. But initially, it was definitely planned and well-organized aggression with the help of the Yugoslav army, which overnight turned into a Serb army trying to basically help these people to organize a greater Serbia, which would fulfill the requirement that all the Serbs live in the same country. So this is just a small note to try to explain to people who are not from the area what is the actual, how did all started, you know. Thanks.
And another set of questions, and both in here and others, that speak about the role of other international actors. So, for example, what was the role of Russia at the time? What was the role of other European countries, since many dragged their feet to actually try to stop what was taking place? And then there are some also that are celebrating US role with the Clinton administration. So how do you assess the complexity of the international actors who often are not far away from any conflict? I know that no one produces their own weapons in the region, so there must have been a weapon supply, ammunition, political protections on the international arenas. So speak about the complexity of the international setting at the time. And anyone could jump to take, Velma, maybe you worked with the tribunal, maybe saw some of the documentations of international actors at the scene.
To be honest, that is not my expertise to kind of like speak about international relationships. So what I can just say from my own experience, being like targeted as a civilian, you know, like spending 4 years in the basement, not having any belief that anybody will come and save us and the war will like keep going. I do see the role of United States of America in this case, you know, for me as a, you know, those people who decided they will step in. I do see that the whole Richard Holbrooke administration, which I would like to kind of, you know, mention here, because he really did play a huge role in Clinton's administration of deciding to combine soft diplomacy with heavy bombing of, you know, Bosnian Serbs who were, for example, surrounding the hills and keeping Sarajevo under the siege, on some way as a crucial step, you know, to intervene and stop this war here. I'm going to mention that, you know, the Europe for 4 years, of course, couldn't figure out how they will approach this conflict. So they were just watching. During that time, United Kingdom also had a role of bystanders. There is a famous saying by Lord David Owen, I think from 1993, don't dream dreams that West will come and save you. So, yeah, I mean, it was quite complex. It's quite complex actually to speak about it. But yeah, I mean, I did highlight the role of the US administration and the fact that, yeah, they combine heavy bombarding and the soft diplomacy together. And that is why Dayton Agreement, which is actually our peace accord, which is not perfect at all, which was just permanent, a temporary solution, not permanent. And now it's something what is blocking the country and dividing her on two entities. Maybe, you know, we can mention that we have two entities, state level, 10 cantons, Brčko district. So to illustrate, the country, which is territorial like Washington, DC, have 186 ministries, but we don't have a state ministry for education, for example.
Here's a map for people who are just looking.
Yeah. So, you know, we do deal with a lot of issues related to educational curriculums and the different interpretation of the recent history. We have the biggest youth unemployment rate. So I'm mentioning the state ministry for education just as example that people can understand what Dayton Agreement is and how much is blocking the country right now. So I will stop here. Maybe some of my colleagues can jump in and give their own opinion.
Herman, you had something
Yeah,
about
sure.
both the Clinton administration and other actors. So if you could possibly comment.
Absolutely. So the reaction of the international community to the dissolution of Yugoslavia was, I would say, very uncoordinated in many ways. However, what did emerge out of the early responses to the claims to independence by Slovenia and Croatia was to accept that if the country goes through a referendum, that the international community was going to accept each of the Republic of Yugoslavia, each state in Yugoslavia, becoming an independent country. This happened in the case of Slovenia and Croatia, and then happened in the case of Bosnia. It is really after the referendum in Bosnia was voted overwhelmingly by 2/3 of Bosnians for independence, which has to be mentioned that pretty much most the Serbs in Bosnia abstained or voted no in that referendum. They obviously did not want Bosnia to become an independent state for the reasons that Ahmed just explained, which is that Serbs wanted to remain in a country that collected all Serbs, in one country, that Bosnia proclaimed its independence, and that independence basically was a signal to the Serbs to attack Bosnia and to try to carve out as much of Bosnian territory as possible, because the people were intermixed in Bosnia across the whole territory. The only way that people could be separated was through ethnic cleansing and genocide, and that's exactly what they did. There are transcripts of the Bosnian Serb parliament that debated this and presented this to the military commander, Ratko Mladic, who ended up committing many crimes in Bosnia, including finally the one in Srebrenica and genocide, and he was actually found guilty on those counts, where the Bosnian Serb parliament presents to him, this is what we want to do. Ratko Mladic says to them, this what you want from me is a genocide. And this is on record. So this was planned, this was all along. In terms of European response, at first they tried to mediate in the conflict, but they tried to do it in a way that wasn't very conducive. Different countries in Europe have different favorites. So the Germans would favor Croats. I think the French favored the Serbs. The Brits were kind of vacillating between the two for a time being. And what is interesting is that later on, there was a book that was published, The Clinton Tapes, by Taylor Branch, and I'm reading just two sentences from that book. President Clinton himself said that the European leaders said that an independent Bosnia would be unnatural as the only Muslim nation in Europe. And then he added, and these are words by President Clinton, President François Mitterrand of France had been especially blunt in saying that Bosnia did not belong, and that British officials spoke of a painful but realistic restoration of Christian Europe. So these are the kind of impulses that took place. However, when some of the atrocities took place, I think some people in Europe were rightfully appalled by those atrocities, and they pressured their countries into doing something about it. And the same happened in the United States. I have to highlight here that actually American Jewish community played a great role in mobilizing American public opinion to be pro-Bosnia and pro-Muslim because of their own experience with the Holocaust in Europe. And for that reason, they were able also to pressure, among other actors, the American government into doing something, eventually intervening, albeit too late, I would say, but better late than never, and that stopped the war. So I would say that in overall, that the perception in Bosnia is among the Muslims, among the Bosnians, that the U.S. role was very positive, that the European role was quite negative for the most part. The perception among the Serbs is very anti-US, very anti-NATO until today. They are a little bit more positive on the Europeans, except that they probably, what you often get in the Serbian media and public discourse is that they basically try the Europeans for not letting them finish the job. And that's something that often comes out in these conversations. As far as the Muslim countries are concerned, the Bosnian Muslims received a lot of humanitarian assistance from the Muslim countries, and they received some military assistance, especially from Iran in 1994, because of the arms embargo on the former Yugoslavia. So one of the most atrocious things that happened was when the whole conflict started in 1991. the UN Security Council placed arms embargo in Yugoslavia, meaning nobody could import weapons. They were thinking that if we prevent influx of weapons into Yugoslavia, we can prevent the conflict. What they didn't know is that Yugoslavia was already heavily armed and that most of those weapons were in the hands of the Serbs. So basically, if you prevent weapons coming in, you are favoring the one who is the strongest in the end. In 1994, the United States government decided, under President Bill Clinton, to turn a blind eye to the Iranian export of weapons to Bosnia. And this has been well documented. Everybody knows about this. Some other sources were procured from Europe on black market, if you will, that helped Bosnians to arm themselves and eventually establish parity with the Serbs. Most of the atrocities, with the exception of Srebrenica and some enclaves in eastern Bosnia, took place in the first 6 months of the war when the Bosnians were pretty much unarmed because the Serbs had all the weapons that were going against defenseless people. Once some parity was established, most of the civilian casualties were stopped, and most of the casualties from then on were in armed conflict between Bosnia. Of course, there were still massacres, but they were on a much smaller scale than what happened, for instance, in eastern, northeastern, northwestern Bosnia at the beginning of the war. I know this is long, but it really is a situation that requires some explaining.
It's an important explanation, and especially I want to maybe pick up one piece that you said about that having Muslims in Bosnia or Bosnia as part of Europe is unnatural and something that's unacceptable. And that takes me back to the expulsion of Muslims from Spain, Muslims and Jews, because to constitute the imaginary Europe, because at the time in 1492, with the Muslims and Jews being expelled, there was no such thing as Europe to think of, because half of Europe was actually, 1/3 of Europe was under Muslim rule. So to constitute Europe, it had to externalize and remove that which did not belong in the imaginary to what Europe is from that construction. And it seems to be continuing till today, whether we see it in relations to Bosnia, see it to how Muslims are seen to be not belonging to Europe. So there's all this notion that Muslims are not natural Europeans, even though that Albania was the only country that actually the number of Jews increased during the Second World War percentage-wise than other parts of Europe. So how much of that still is the strong current? And maybe that could get us into this whole notion of using Bosnian and Bosnian genocide by the ultranationalists, by those who, if Mitterrand is saying that is Bosnian Muslims are unnatural in Europe, so you don't have to go to the extreme ultranationalist in order to understand where that logic is actually get to be fed and continue to be part of the thinking process. Anyone can pick. Again, this is just my own reflection. You could pick any part of it.
Yeah. So I would like to say just a few things about that. There is a very famous Yugoslav, I should say, Oriental scholar, Orientalist, as we would say, Aleksandar Popovic, who lived in France, and I think many people know about his work. So he came up with this idea, and he mentions that in some of his works about the peripheral Islam in the Balkans. So even from the perspective of Islam as a religion or the Muslim world, Islam and the presence of Muslims in the Balkans is peripheral without really explaining where the center of that Islam is. So you can see that even in scholarly works, this idea that Islam and Muslims do not belong, and they are unnatural, not only from the European point of view, but also from the Muslim point of view. This is like a peripheral Islam that's barely even Islam, and somehow we got everything wrong, because the Bosnian church in the medieval period was heterodox, and now that we are Muslims, we are peripheral Muslims. So we seem not to be able to make anything right about religion, and because of that, we have to be removed. Apart from this bad seed theory that Ermin already mentioned, there's also an idea that's very prominent with within the Serb ideology, that the long Ottoman centuries, in many ways, prevented the Serb nation from attaining the high ground in culture, in literacy, in I don't know, in all aspects of cultural and social life. So basically, they look upon this Ottoman period as dark ages that basically arrested the natural development of Serbia and Serb ethnic group into a proper Christian European nation. So because of all of that, there's a question of historical revenge. There's a question of basically removing the representatives, the last remaining representatives of the Ottoman Empire from the area. And it's small surprise that this very discourse was used very, I should say, very ably during the Bosnian War, because the Serbs basically, they presented themselves as cleansing the Europe and removing the Muslim presence in the Balkans. And we are the antemurale Christianitatis, bulwark of the Christendom and things like that. And it was basically a way to ennoble their causes. It is a very clear territorial and political dispute, but religion got mobilized to basically prompted it into at a much higher level. But definitely Muslims and there is this talk about the green transversal, everybody knows about that in the Balkans, that somehow Muslims are trying to drive a neo-Ottoman Muslim wedge into the Southern Europe, because if you look at the maps of Bosnia and Serbia and Montenegro and Macedonia, there's a certain area that is Muslim populated. So the Serb ideology basically promoted this idea that we somehow want to be connected with our mother Turkey, and it's a whole history of that. And unfortunately, for academic purposes, it is arrested in a small Bosnian language, so many people don't know about that. But it's a very, very large body of text that can be analyzed in terms of Islamophobic discourse historically and in the present day. Sorry for taking.
I know there was a question that came up about how is the curriculum in terms of school education dealing with the Bosnian genocide, both in Bosnia, but also some outside. I know in some places it's almost completely erased. Has there been any effort at incorporating in the curriculum, whether it's in the K through 12 school? Also, what type of projects are underway at the university level to document, to research, to develop? I know that both have research centers that work on this subject. So how does it look like from a curriculum, from a schooling system, from an educational perspective? What is taking place? Maybe Balma, if you want to start, and then I'll go to Sabiha.
I mean, I'm going to mention just briefly, there are efforts, but it depends from in which entity you are, talking about. Of course, in the federal entity, which is majority Muslims and Croat population, there is Bosniak Muslims. There is initiative, for example, Canton of Sarajevo had initiative to incorporate some of the ICT International Tribunal for Former Yugoslavia findings into the curriculums. If we talk about entity of Republika Srpska, we are facing complete denial of the recent past, especially genocide. I'm going to again talk about genocide because it's 25th anniversary. I mentioned how we are dealing with the 3 different curriculums or 3 different interpretation of the recent history. it also depends from school to school. For example, while I was working on this documentary, I came to testify in Foča for the PBS TV. We had a chance to follow up with one history class in elementary school. So kids were from, I think, 9 till 14 years old. And I was quite surprised to see that they were like literally learning about the Dayton Agreement, you know, such a young kids being exposed to something such a complicated as the Dayton Agreement, which I studied while I was studying political science at the Faculty of Political Science in Sarajevo. I was quite surprised. So this is a big problem. Like literally everything what have been done up till now is non-formal education, which we do through non-governmental or civil society sector. But this is also difficult because we cannot entrance to schools, or if we can, that depends definitely from the willingness of local professors or directors who are willing to risk its own work to allow us, for example, to do a peace building class. So, yeah, I mean, the whole effort stayed on non-governmental sector. Hopefully, the non-governmental sector and civil society would utilize a joint effort and put a pressure and be a watchdog of government and request, you know, the change. So, yeah, I mentioned we have all these 186 ministries, but we don't have a state ministry for education. To illustrate, if you want to take, for example, peace building exhibition into the high school, you have to send a bunch of different emails, not even emails, you know, they ask you to send a fax because our government doesn't even sometimes use emails. So you have to have like a couple of permissions and call a bunch of people, and it's really complicated. It's really complicated. So yeah, that's briefly.
How about from the European Union? Is there any support effort both on documenting, but also that this is in the heart of Europe, and how is the European Union dealing with it?
I mean, the only support, I'm just going to mention briefly, the only support we have is actually from the international community. Like it's the only support which we are getting, we non-governmental sector and civil society. So yeah, it's not that I'm criticizing that part, but I'm going to mention just one thing. The Srebrenica Genocide Memorial in Potocari, they did establish a great initiative where, you know, kids from elementaries and universities, students will be coming to the Srebrenica Genocide Memorial. So they will have one historical class. So that is a big deal, but that is just for the federation entity. So go ahead, Sabiha. Sorry for jumping in.
No, good, Sabiha.
I only want to add something regarding curriculum. Unfortunately, 25 years after the war stopped in Bosnia and Herzegovina, we have in some cantons 2 schools under one roof. It means that students or children do not have opportunity to listen, to learn the same topic. Even they do not have opportunity to spend together that time during the break. That is big question, and I really think that international communities together with our governments need to solve that problem if we want to think about peace or even reconciliation in our country. And also what I want to mention when we speak about these topics such as genocide or war, rape and sexual violence, unfortunately, we do not have that topics through regular curriculum, as my colleague Velma mentioned. But what we as women's organization, non-governmental organizations, try to do in Bosnia and Herzegovina, Medica Zajednica, but also other women's organizations, we try to document that life stories and then develop on innovative way methodology how younger generations can learn from past to prevent similar things. We cannot say, okay, younger generation need to forget everything what happened in the past. We cannot think about future if we are not ready to speak about very hard experiences from different sides, such as genocide and war, rape, and sexual violence. We really, as non-governmental organizations, also try to collaborate with our universities in different cantons, even in Republika Srpska, to include this topic to its regular curriculum. It is not easy, but we cannot give up about this.
Ahmed, how about at the university? Is there any research line, center, even in the Islamic studies field, is there actually courses that looks at both the history of Bosnia in relations to the genocide, or is it tangential? I know outside of Bosnia, it's extremely tangential, and you'll find only very few places that actually engage the subject matter in any serious way.
Mm. In fact, the University of Sarajevo, we have an institute for research of crimes against humanity, which is a full member school of our university. Mm-hmm. And it has, to the best of my knowledge, some 10 to 15 people who actually write about various aspects of Bosnian conflict, including, of course, genocide, and they use documentary materials from the Hague Tribunal, from state archives, and of course, individual interviews and documentation that was collected through various NGOs like Medica and all other institutions. But there is a basic problem with all of this, and the basic problem is that we do not function as a society. It's very brutal and very hard to say that, but to my mind, that's true. We don't share experiences of the past, and we don't share values or assumptions for the present or the future, and all of that is connected. When we were talking about the Clinton administration and all of that, so if I am to impersonate a Bosnian nationalist, which I will do right now, so it doesn't matter if I believe in that or not, I can say that the value judgment of the United States' role in the Bosnian conflict is a very mixed bag. You know, I can tell that there was a full awareness that a genocide is going on in Bosnia. Very early on, they gave it a euphemism name of ethnic cleansing, just as an alibi to do nothing for many years. And then in 1995, when the Bosnian army, 120,000 strong Bosnian army, turned the table on the aggressors and the occupators, they basically threatened to bombard the Bosnian forces to prevent them from entering Banja Luka and many other places that were currently part of the Republika Srpska. And apart from that, we were in a way pushed, so I don't know what's the right word, forced, pushed to accept this entity within Bosnia, and basically, which means that the results, direct results of ethnic cleansing and genocide were not removed, which is probably a unique case in world history. So the parallel of that would be that you have an inter-Hanwe entity within Rwanda, which basically, denies that a genocide in Rwanda took place, and we have to deal with them as a respectable partners. So we have to sit down with them. So it's not like it happened in the Nuremberg trials, you know, because a new social, when you pass a judgment on the criminal activities of the old social order, it has to be replaced with the new social order that will accept reasonably what happened in the past. Here, it was not the case. We have to sit at the same table and negotiate, you know, and we have to, like, we have half of our country at the highest political level denies that genocide in Srebrenica in particular, to say nothing about other places, never took place. And it's very hard to come to any consensus to any consensus, including to have something in schools being taught. And it doesn't matter that all these judgments were passed by international court, which we don't have any influence over. It's not that a tiny Bosnian Muslim community, you know, has all this magical power to influence the outcome of what the Hague Tribunal would pass as a judgment, or what would happen in various administrations around the world. So it's brutal, but it's true. We do not function as a society. Whether that will happen in any foreseeable future or not, it's very, very hard to say. But we have denial as the last stage of genocide. And of course, when you have that, you cannot even begin the process of reconciliation. And if you ask me for my personal opinion, any admission doesn't mean anything to me. You know, it only means to the perpetrator, because then he can start the healing process of himself. And then on new basis, we will be able to forge a new relationship that will bring a new vision for the future. But currently, we are basically locked into this affirmation on one side and denial on the other side. So whatever we do, as my esteemed colleague said, it's through unofficial channels. It's NGOs, it's University of Sarajevo that has this school, and basically you don't have acceptance of basic historical facts about what happened in remote or recent history. And that's a major issue, of course. Thank you.
Yeah. Hatem, can I?
No, go ahead.
Yeah, so my colleagues here have talked more about the perspective from inside Bosnia, because obviously they live there. I live in the United States. So I want to bring an international perspective to this. What is worrying Hatem and everybody else is, who's listening to this, is that we have in the last several years started seeing a more prominent denial of genocide in Srebrenica and Bosnia on an international scale. So you have someone like Peter Handke.
When we posted our event on the various Facebook and ads and so on, we had actually many people that were commenting, saying that there was no such thing as a genocide, and then pointing out why don't you talk about ISIS and so on. Mm-hmm. So I could actually verifiably, quantifiably point to it from the various people that are actually engaged with the post specifically about this event.
Yeah,
go ahead.
Absolutely. So you have someone like Peter Handke, who just got the Nobel Prize for Literature, who is also a genocide denier. You have people like Noam Chomsky, who constantly undermines what happened in Srebrenica and in Bosnia. You have many others, obviously Serbian politicians, leaders, Prime Minister Ana Brnabić, and many others, obviously all Serbian politicians. So what you need on one level, Hatem, is what happened in Germany at the end of the World War II, which was denazification, right? This is something that never took place in Serbia. The same ideology that caused all this misery and destruction and war in the Balkans, in the former Yugoslavia, in the 90s, is ruling Serbia and ruling in Republika Srpska, the Serb-controlled part of Bosnia. So imagine if in 1970, in Europe, in Germany, you have Nazi power, Nazi party in power, at least in parts of Germany. That's pretty much what people in Bosnia are living today and what they're experiencing. As long as that doesn't happen, I am not confident and I am not optimistic that any kind of reconciliation is going to take place. Reconciliation can only take place when the party that is culpable for most of the crimes that had been committed, and this had been verified by all international institutions, really comes to terms with their own violence, and they haven't until today. That is one thing. The other thing is that these violent acts that they had committed in the 90s, especially against the Muslims, are now proving to be highly motivational among right-wing white supremacist groups throughout the world. So it is not incidental that the person who committed the terrorist act in New Zealand and killed 58 people in the mosque was on the way to the mosque. He was listening to the Serbian music, right? That glorified the war criminals like Karadzic and Mladic and so on and so forth. That's not incidental.
Visited, Croatia, Bosnia, Hungary, Bulgaria between 2016 2018, almost like did a visitation to the sites of historical battles, in a sense to prepare himself for what he possibly thought about his own battle in New Zealand.
Exactly, and then you have Breivik, who committed those crimes in Norway, right, on that island, who killed all those young people. He was also in his like meandering manifesto that he wrote. He had a prominent place for Serbs there, and basically to use them as a good example of how Muslims should be dealt with. So this Serbian violence against Muslims in Bosnia is now becoming inspirational for many of right-wing white supremacists throughout the world. We've seen that even here in the United States in the last few months, where we had some of these white supremacist groups gathering against Black Lives Matter and so on. Some of them were wearing the Serbian insignia and the Serbian kind of style uniforms. And that's not incidental. And that brings me to a point that you brought early on when you introduced, which is racialization of the Muslims. Mm-hmm. So there is ethnically and in terms of appearance practically no difference in the countries of the former Yugoslavia between a Muslim and someone who is not a Muslim. I mean, if you walk the street of Bosnia and you walk by a Muslim or a Serb or a Croat, you wouldn't know that just by looking at them, unless they had some very visible marker of their identity, maybe wearing a cross or a woman wearing a hijab or something like that. Other than that, you simply wouldn't know. Yet in the minds of some people, the Muslims are the brown people of Europe. The Muslims of Bosnia are even the brown people of Bosnia. We have this famous example in Mostar where this Croat young man who's never been to the Muslim side of Mostar was asked about the Muslims and did he ever go to the Muslim side, and he said, no, I never did, but you know, they are different, they are darker in color and whatnot. So in his mind, Muslims have already been racialized. Of course, in reality, that's not the truth, but what is important here is that this notion, this narrative is being created, and that regardless of your color of the skin or how you look, which of course doesn't matter in the end, you know, at all who is what color, but in the minds of racialist people, it matters. And for them, Muslims are brown no matter how they look, no matter, even if you're white and as pale as you know, as whatever, you know, they would not recognize you as such. And I think this is something new. We hadn't seen this before. Racialization of Bosnian Muslims. I think we are hearing more of that in the last 5 to 10 years because we have internationalization of this anti-Muslim Islamophobic racialist discourse around the world.
Cognizant of time, we're getting into the tail end of it. And maybe we could, a few questions about, are you optimistic about the future in Bosnia, efforts for reconciliations? And I know you already mentioned of that. How does it look like on the ground? My last visit, again, coming from the airport, I still saw in Sarajevo buildings that are still bear the footprints of the war. They still have not been rebuilt. So how do we really just think about the reconciliation and where we are at? And I see Ahmed raise your hand. You raised your hand before I started, but
I just wanted to say something about what Ermin just said, but we already moved to a new point, so let's continue.
Well, go ahead. If you have something, you could jump in, and then we could move into that question.
I think one of the reasons for that is that Bosnian War is the first on-air war. It was the most filmed war in recent history. So it's not that we all had smartphones and stuff, but you know, hand cameras were available, and there are many scenes of very gruesome atrocities that were caught on tape. And this is one aspect. It's very graphic and it's available in color video, and people were watching that. And on the other hand, there's this tension between what happened in Bosnia being at the same time local and international. So these are crimes against humanity. So it matters in every corner of this globe on the one side. And of course, we insist on it being international, not only because of this definition, but because those facts that were established by international courts were authentic and probably at some point will be prone to acceptance by the perpetrators. Because of course, we don't trust each other. So if I say as Ahmed from Bosnia that something happened, somebody who is, I don't know, Serb or Croat would not necessarily trust in my version of things, right? Or in my narrative. But we have this international court with past judgment on these things. So this is another important legal international aspect of the whole issue. On the other hand, obviously what happened in Srebrenica and in many other municipalities throughout Bosnia happened within the course of the Bosnian War, which is very conditioned in every sense in terms of, in temporal, in spatial terms, this is actually one of the bloody episodes in a series of bloody episodes that form the armed conflict in Bosnia. So there's a lot of tension between it being at the same time a local thing that happened in this geography, in this space and this time frame, and it being international, filmed, available, which unfortunately can serve, as we see, as a source of motivation and inspiration to some people to do things like a massacre in Christchurch and places like that.
Thank you. So again, going back to my question about reconciliation effort, things that really, how does it look on the ground? Also, maybe the other question, are there other people that need to be brought by the International Court to face? I know it ended its work in 2017, but are there other individuals that should be held responsible? Is that part of the effort to have reconciliation, or are we just counting the day for another future conflict? So how does it look?
Can I say something and then I will keep quiet?
Can
I say something and I will keep quiet after that?
Okay.
So there, to my mind, there's a measure of racial attitude towards not only Muslims, but all ethnic groups in the Balkans. So in a way, by all the judgments of the International Court in The Hague, we were treated as children who quarreled over some toys, got reprimanded, scolded, got a thrashing, and sent out to our rooms. We were basically treated as completely irresponsible and incapable people. Why? Because one important charge was missing from the list of all charges, and that's a commencement of an aggressive war, which was part of the Nuremberg trials. So we have to establish who began this whole thing. And it's very clearly, because of that, there's a sense that everybody shares in responsibility, all sides committed crimes, which is something that's known in Islamic tradition as al-haq yuradu bihal batil. So it's a truth that affirms falsehood. So it's a truism. It's true that all sides committed crimes, but those crimes are not at the same level. And these are not identical things. Because of that, we basically have the situation that's currently prevalent in the Balkans, because it was never established who was responsible for the beginning of this aggressive war in the Balkans. So we can know the first thing about it. They have nothing against trials for people who committed crimes, that's no problem. Even genocide, no problem. But there's a high political decision, to my mind, and it has been written about it by Florence Hartman and other people who are insiders of the tribunal workings. There was a high political decision that said no country or ethnic group should be burdened to the point that will prevent reconciliation in the future. So it was all the leveling up. Everybody's guilty. Go out to your rooms. We will try you separately. You're all guilty, and you have to sit back at the negotiating table and get an agreement. Whatever you agree upon, we will agree with that. That's impossible. It's not possible. You know, it's impossible for Paul Kagame and Interhamwe to sit and negotiate about what happened in Rwanda. The whole world knows what happened in Rwanda, and you have to say it. This is what happened, and this is who is responsible for that. The Serb ideology was never conquered, not militarily, not politically. That's why we have a new surge that's currently in the Balkans. Thank you so much, and I will not say a single word until the end.
No, we're not sending you to your room yet. So maybe we'll take the last 20 minutes of this conversation. There are a set of questions in the chat. So if you could take a look at the question and answer, look at those questions, and see if anyone that you want to pick to answer, respond to, while also thinking of the question that I posed to you about how does it look like in terms of the reconciliation, or are we just buying time for a future conflict depending on the changes that might occur in the ground and the type of political setup that is still a very fractured political setup. So Sabiha, go ahead, by all means.
Okay, I want to say something from my perspective when we speak about this very hard topic in very late night. We need to go to bed. But it was hard time, but hard topics. But however, I want to mention some positive things from Bosnia and Herzegovina when we speak about war, rape, and sexual violence. First of all, the survivors, women and girls, started to speak up about these hard experiences. It was very important. We encouraged them to speak up and give them opportunity to give their testimonies. And then first time in history, sexual violence recognized, as my colleague Velma said, and some other colleagues, as criminal act, genocide, or criminal act or genocide, or how I say, a crime against humanity. It was first time in history. Second positive things happened that we as a women's organization request from Islamic community to issue some concrete religion explanation like fatwa or proclamation that people accept and respect women who survived sexual violence and war rape. Also, it was first time in history over the world we didn't have that kind of experiences. What was so good regarding destigmatization women who survived of sexual violence. And third things, what is also very important, again, first time in history happening, that survivors of sexual violence were recognized through our law that they can apply for the status of civil victims of the war. It means in one part of Bosnia, unfortunately in Federation, that they can apply for the status of civil victims of the war, that they receive some concrete financial support from our government. And I hope that we will have similar experiences also in Republika Srpska, or is better to say in the whole territory of Bosnia and Herzegovina. And also, if you recognize, I didn't use word victim. After 25 years, I really want to show respect to women people who survived different kind of war trauma, but especially war, rape, and sexual violence, that they are survivors. They recognize their own strengths. They didn't die. They continue with their life. They are today mothers, sisters. They are so active in community, in family. And also, I want to emphasize that I believe and contribute to women's strengths, activities, and our work step by step with clear vision of equal rights, social justice, and positive gender changes. That is my goal when we speak about reconciliation and peace in Bosnia and Herzegovina. That is why I want to finish this, my explanation and sharing experience from Bosnia with positive examples. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Dalma, do you have? We can hear you.
So yeah, sorry, it's quite late. So I would like to just mention, Ahmed mentioned, these phases of genocide through the Professor Gregory Stanton, and the last phases. Actually, denial, but what I would like to mention, and there is a new great theory by our academic Haris Halilovic, who is speaking now about triumphalism and the celebration and glorification of war crimes and war criminals and rehabilitation of war criminals. So I do see that as a large, huge problem. Because if you have a student dorm with the name with the name of war criminal Radovan Karadžić at Pale, that is a really, really bad message for the future generation. There is also concern related to a couple of new, actually 2 new commissions being established by government of Republika Srpska, which should do revision of the recent events in towards Srebrenica genocide and the siege of Sarajevo. And we are expecting the results sometimes in September. So these steps and, constant denial by the government of Republika Srpska, investing a lot of money, lobbying also internationally. Ermin mentioned, huge level of denial coming from the international community now. It's really concerning toward, all these necessary steps. I mentioned memorialization and the fact that we don't have a state law and we don't have idea how we will actually commemorate a recent past, then impunity for perpetrators. You did ask about the court processes or the war crimes procedures. Since the Hague Tribunal is closing its mandate, there is only two cases we are waiting now. Ratko Mladic, which we are hoping that it will, happen soon before he died, and Stanišić and Simatovic. Following the closure of the ICTY, war crimes trials have been left to the national and to the national courts of BiH. Some war crime cases are going on in Belgrade, in Serbia. So yeah, I mean, there is still a lot of perpetrators walking freely around Bosnia, and especially in small communities. That depends, where you are living, but in some small communities, mothers are still facing those who took their kids. However, I would like to end it up also positively, as Sabiha mentioned, and she highlighted some of these cases, which also Medica participated and did through years. They did an incredible job. I would like to mention, because she mentioned these 2 schools under one roof, and how we still have that pure example of segregation, I would say. I would like to mention the courage of these young people from one school in central Bosnia, Jajce. They started to, organize themselves. They are high school students, so they started to organize themselves, and they were starting to protesting and requesting, the change for the curriculum, and they wanted to go together to school. Then international community, especially OSCE, they supported and they recognized these efforts, and they have been highlighted, and they have been a good example that the change can come from the inside. We should not be waiting international community. We should not be waiting, like, I do understand that we do need, support and help, but I'm hoping that young people, like these young people from Jajce, would, you know, decide, and they would start to request and take their own destiny and their own lives in their own hands. So yeah, with this, I will end it up. Thank you so much, everybody who participated. Thank you, Dr. Hatem, for organizing this event about Bosnia and Srebrenica genocide and putting us on the international agenda. I wish you all good day or good night.
Thank you. Erman, any concluding?
Yeah, so I'm grateful to my colleagues from Bosnia for their perspective, and obviously they are much better informed about the situation on the ground than those of us who live overseas, no matter how well informed we are. At the same time, I wish I could say that I'm very optimistic. I'm not very optimistic for a number of reasons. Some are internal to Bosnia that pretty much we talked about so far, and many are external. Like I said, in Serbia, there is still the ideology of Greater Serbia is in power. Aleksandar Vučić, the president of Serbia, is a radical. He was a member of Serbian Radical Party. He actually was recorded near Sarajevo during the war, taking shots and whatnot. So as long as that kind of generation of politicians and that orientation is in power in Serbia, I don't think we can expect that much peace in Bosnia, so to say. And even, I don't know if you've heard, there have been the last week or so, there have been protests and demonstrations in Belgrade, and actually many of the demonstrators are chanting the name of Ratko Mladic and other war criminals. So those that would bring down Vučić may actually be worse than him. And that's quite something, you know. So, so again, I don't want to paint a negative picture, but we have a demographic issue. People are leaving Bosnia in great numbers. We have a complex political system. Economic situation has already been really bad, and COVID is going to make it almost unbearable for a lot of people. Then you have the external factors. Then you have the Russian meddling. And then you have the Europeans who are really not trying to do anything significant and serious. So I think as far as Bosnia as a country is concerned, especially as Bosniaks or Bosnian Muslims are concerned, it really is a survival mode, I would say. But at the same time, I think the good work needs to continue. The fact that we have all of the good works that Sabiha and Velma had been mentioning, especially at the level of NGOs, that creates knowledge, local knowledge, how to deal with these situations. When we have international institutions with all these major decisions that are now on historical record, you know, these nationalist ideologies may go away in decades or centuries to come. I hope they will go away as soon as possible. But the historical decisions taken by international institutions, international court, are not going to go away. They're going to stay for posterity. And that people would know that a genocide was committed in Bosnia, and they would know the name of the perpetrators. And this is important. So that good work has to continue. That gives us a dose of optimism. But we also had seen the rise of global white supremacy, Islamophobia, and all of that, that makes this small population, and we're talking about fewer than 2 million people, really, of Bosnian Muslims in Bosnia, really in a very precarious situation. So I wouldn't want to paint a pessimistic picture. I'm an optimist by nature. At the same time, I also want to be realistic that I think that it's going to be a very difficult coming period. But I also am confident that, that we will continue, and that we will continue creating good work as we had been always.
Thank you, Erman. Ahmed, last sentences for you today. We started with you, we'll conclude with you.
Let me be your local optimist. As they say, optimists are uninformed pessimists.
Well, you studied Ibn al-Arabi, so I don't know what can I say.
Well, the thing is, as you mentioned in the beginning, I studied in the United States, and I decided to come back to Bosnia with my family. Mm-hmm. I have children, I live here, and it's an act of, I don't know, believe in the future of this country in a way. I don't know. There are many obstacles and problems, but I don't want to sound too philosophical or over dramatic, but it seems to me that what is at stake is again relevant for the world that we live in. So what we have in Bosnia are different ethnic, confessional groups inhabiting a certain geographical area. So either we will learn or continue living peacefully next to each other and be harmonious as much as possible as a social order in society, or this will be a predicament for the whole world. We are not the only multicultural society in the world. So what will happen in Kashmir, what will happen in India, what will happen in China, what will happen in many places that have these very divergent and different communities that basically live next to each other or with each other. So this is, to my mind, this is at stake. And I think we will have to find a way to reconcile, to accept what happened in the past, and to find a way forward to live in this country, because I do believe that many people here in the Balkans or in Bosnia particularly still see diversity as a value. It's a big challenge. It has been challenged a lot and people lost faith in all of that. But I do believe that people still see some social value in this diversity of the Balkans as a whole, and especially in Bosnia. So I am, how should I say, carefully optimistic.
Okay. Cautiously optimistic, but
yes. Thank you so much for organizing this beautiful panel and for inviting us and bringing these important issues for discussion.
Thank you, Ahmad. Thank you, Ermin. Thank you, Sabiha. Thank you, Velma, for really enriching us and giving us an opportunity just to have an encounter and be able to discuss and spend some time on Bosnia. I do look forward to coming back and visiting Sarajevo. My last visit was speaking at the public library, as it was just was recently renovated, and I went up to visit the graves and offer my prayers. So I do look forward to coming back and visiting, and look forward.
We should go together, Hatem. You and I should go together.
That's it. It's a promise, and I know as soon as
with Velma and Sabiha and Ahmed
about me, definitely we will for sure visit, and hopefully the COVID-19 will be behind us. I do pray and wish all of you and your families good health, safety at this particular time. May your days and futures be better than what it is today, and you will stay be with our prayers. And for all our audience, please include Bosnia and the Bosnians both in your prayers, but also in your ability, if you have a time to visit, by all means. Being there is one way to support and express support for the communities. It's a beautiful, beautiful city. For me, Sarajevo, it's a walkable city, nice bridges with the water flowing in the middle, nice restaurants. It's really a place to visit. So I look forward for this and encourage everyone to make Bosnia one of their places to visit and to relate to the communities that are there. And I do have an interest in the library, so just to be sure. So thank you everyone for being with us, and bid you farewell. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam.